Welcome to the latest edition of our Talk Death video series, where you get the chance to ask experts your questions about all things death and dying.
A reminder to subscribe to our YouTube channel and to follow us on Instagram at TalkDeath for your daily dose of death positivity.
Today's guest is Cassandra Yonder, a fellow Canadian advocating for community-centered death care. Cassandra wants to encourage cultural re-engagement with dying, death care, and grief.
Cassandra runs one of the largest Facebook groups dedicated to alternative death care practices, as well as deathcaring.ca, a virtual school for community death caring. Check out the description below to learn more about Cassandra and deathcaring.ca.
Welcome, Cassandra.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Rachel PJ from Facebook wants to know, are home funerals possible in cities where most people live in small apartments and couldn't host a service or a stream of people coming by to bid farewell? How do you manage basically a home or DIY funeral in that case?
I mean, I guess I'd really go back to this idea of what is a home funeral. And so if a home funeral is just sort of family and community reclaiming the care of their own dead, then it's going to look however it looks. It's going to be totally different for each family. So, I mean, I think each family is going to have to face some pretty similar hurdles in terms of what needs to be done, and they're going to problem solve their way through that. I don't know how much you wanted me to get into sort of describing home funerals, but when a death occurs, I mean, it's either an expected death or an unexpected death. And if it was expected death at home, then people are going to already be providing, some hands-on care. They will have already been caring for that person at the end of life, and that care can kind of extend. They're already sort of set up for that. They're going to have to deal with the paperwork of filing the death, which is going to involve getting the last physician who saw the patient to sign off on the statement of death and the medical certificate of death to get the statement of death. There's also some basic care hurdles that need to be overcome in terms of how is that body going to be looked after immediately at the time of death and following death. How long is that period going to go on? What type of vigiling? And these questions all have a gazillion answers. And then we sort of move into the idea of disposition. So what kind of disposition is the family going to choose? And given that type, what are the steps that need to be taken? Is there transportation that needs to go on to go from point A to point B? Is it to a crematorium or is it to a cemetery? So there's just so many ways that it could go. And to look at the specifics of being in a small apartment, there's just some problem solving that's going to need to be done around that. Maybe when if it was an expected death at home, maybe it's just a small gathering at that time, and then perhaps it's direct cremation and the body perhaps goes to a crematorium. Maybe family and friends gather at the crematorium for like a witness cremation. Maybe the disposition happens at one time and a memorial happens at another time. I've even heard of situations where family have reached out to local places like a yoga studio or a church or a place of worship or a funeral home that can actually host an event for them. Actually, I love how difficult that question is to answer because it just proves that, there is no if A then B, if B then C.
Yeah.
You just kind of have to work your way through it and get the help where you need it. I mean, Nancy Poor is a great grandmother in the home funeral movement, and she says it comes down to support. Families might not have the resources to do the kind of home funeral that you're seeing on Google in the pictures. In every given situation, it's going to look different all the time. And I just hope that, again, that the locus of control is with the family, that the family realizes this is my dead person. Mm-hmm. So from a legal standpoint, the way that I like to look at sort of ownership, I guess, for lack of a better terms, legal ownership of human remains, the way I think about it myself, is that basically the medical examiner or the coroner owns the human remains until they've figured out what the cause of death is. And once that's been recorded, then basically the next of kin owns human remains again. And this brings me to an interesting point. I feel like so often in the home funeral movement, we talk about the privilege or the rights to reclaim the care of our own dead. But let's take that a little bit further and look at our obligation to care for our own dead. That's an obligation that we have to fulfill that we're then hiring a funeral director to do for us. But it's so weird. We look at it the opposite way around, right? Mm-hmm. Like I'm often working with people who, let's say that a death has occurred in like a hospital. So they're looking at this whole thing around the body release policy. And so hospitals know how to release bodies to funeral directors, right? They've done it a million times. There's like this set paperwork. And now that families are showing up saying, no, I'd like to claim my loved one's body, and I know I'm
Yeah.
going to take it home in the car. And there's no law preventing this, but the people at the hospital are going to be like, what?
Yeah.
You can't do that. We've never heard of this before. And so in order to solve the problem, I'm giggling because I've heard that hospitals have created a new form to release bodies to directly to families.
Huh.
But the great irony of that is that the form exists in the first place because the body already belongs to the family, and they're signing off saying that they've given the funeral director the right to take over that care. So when we
That's so
understand, I
interesting.
think, how ironic that is, then I think we really start to understand this idea of reclaiming post-death care.
Yeah, and how the perception, like it's almost just a matter of understanding your rights at the end of the day, and people really don't realize that. I really like the idea that you proposed of, using like a community space to hold a service. So, there are, like you mentioned, like some logistics of being able to transport the body to that location, but I feel like it's completely doable as well. And just like you said, there are funeral homes who would be more than willing, not all, of course, but there will be some who will easily rent you one of their spaces. And I feel like that's almost even where like funeral professionals can work with families as well and be like, hey, do everything yourself, and if you need help, like we're here. And not a lot of
Yeah.
funeral directors are doing that, but I think that some of them
But
may
we
be
know
doing that more and more.
K666 will be doing that.
Exactly. This makes your use of the language of community-centered death care make a lot more sense to me, right? Because a home funeral is almost a misnomer because it doesn't necessarily need to take place in the home, and I think that becomes a stumbling block for people as we've been
Totally.
discussing. So I
Yeah,
think it makes a lot of sense that you're using the language of community-centered, community-oriented.
definitely.
Yeah.
And the word community means so many different things to different people. I often struggle with using words like family and community without like predefining what those are because they're so wide open. But I do think that you're right. This is such an opportunity. My background was in architecture, and so I love thinking about the spaces and the places where death caring can happen. So I get really, really juiced up about this conversation, especially about the idea that funeral directors are already creating these places and spaces, right? It's just that people are saying they're not the type of spaces and places we want anymore.
Yeah.
But there's so much room for what they could be. I think most Canadians just feel like funeral homes are wrong now. They just feel like they're decorated weird, they've got a weird atmosphere. I just think they don't feel like they fit anymore. But those same places could just be designed in a different way, like you're saying, to be a different space. So an example I'll give is when I was in studying grief and bereavement, we had a class trip in London, Ontario, to a cemetery that also had a crematorium. And we went into the entry of the crematorium, which was like it was a sacred space. It was supposed to be non-denominational, but it was what you'd imagine. It was a beautiful space, like a nice size for a gathering of between 20 to 100 type people. Like that was kind of the size of it. It was all clad in like lovely wood. It was sort of cathedral ceilings, so it sort of gave you a heightened sense of sacredness, whatever sort of that might be for you. And then at the front of this kind of sacred, I'm struggling with that term, but anyway, we'll just let that. I think people know what I mean. At the front of it was a door into a space that was like exactly the opposite that. It had that kind of green painted metal room, and the retort was back there. And anyway, so we saw that space. And then outside on the grass, there was the lawn cemetery, and there was also a little worn spot on the grass. And I said, well, what's that worn patch about? And they said, oh, well, some people, it's part of their faith tradition to have outdoor funeral pyres. And since they can't do that in this part of the world, they tend to gather out there on the lawn to watch the smoke rising from the burning of their loved one's body. And I just thought, of course they do. Of course they do. I mean, it makes sense. You want to see the smoke from the burning of your loved one's body rise, right? Like that's an architectural problem. begging for an architectural solution.
Hmm.
And I also look at the architecture of when we were in the weird kind of industrial retort space. I just thought, why is there this weird division where like the people are gathering here in sort of in love and ceremony and ritual, and then there's kind of this back door to the like body processing plant, and then you go out to the bare patch on the lawn. Like that just begs for some better
Yeah.
architecture, right?
So funeral directors watching, take that as a
Yep,
note.
totally. Yeah.